Secrets at the Quartermain Mansion, the poisoning that shook Port Charles. The quiet elegance of Port Charles was shattered when beloved Ned Quartermain collapsed outside Bobby's, sending shockwaves through the entire community. What initially appeared to be a tragic heart attack would soon reveal itself as something far more sinister, a calculated act of poisoning that threatened to tear apart the fabric of one of the town's most prominent families. As Ned clung to life in a hospital bed, fighting for every breath, Detective Dante Falconeri and his newly reinstated partner Nathan West found themselves drawn into one of the most perplexing cases of their careers, a mystery that would challenge their investigative skills and test the bonds of family and loyalty. The collapse that changed everything. The day began like any other in Port Charles, with autumn leaves drifting lazily through the streets and residents going about their daily routines. Ned Quartermain had been in good spirits, having just received news about the return of some precious family heirlooms that had been temporarily moved. However, his mood took a dramatic turn when he discovered that Drew Kane had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to have the boxes redirected to his own residence instead. The confrontation outside Bobby's was intense, with Ned's anger mounting as Drew gloated over his victory, laughing callously as the older man's face flushed with rage. "You think you can just take what's mine?" Ned demanded, his voice sharp with fury. Drew merely smirked, unfazed by Ned's mounting ire. "They're just things, Ned, but I have to admit, watching you lose it is priceless." What happened next horrified everyone within eyeshot. Ned suddenly clutched at his chest, his face contorting in agony as he collapsed to the pavement below. Emma Scorpio Drake and Joe Palmieri, who had just stepped out of the restaurant, immediately rushed to his aid. Joe, his grandson, cradled Ned's head while frantically calling for emergency services. "Grandpa! Grandpa! Stay with me." Gio's voice trembled as he desperately tried to keep his grandfather conscious. Britt Westburn, who was working her shift at the hospital nearby, heard the commotion and emerged from the building just as paramedics were arriving. She quickly took over, performing CPR on Ned as the sirens wailed through the streets. The medical team transported him urgently to General Hospital, where the grim reality became clear. Ned had suffered a severe cardiac event, but something wasn't quite right. His condition was far too unusual, too aggressive. After a battery of tests and consultations with specialists, doctors made a shocking discovery. Ned had been poisoned. The investigation begins. When Acting Commissioner Dante Falconeri learned the full extent of what had happened to Ned, he knew this case demanded his immediate attention. The poisoning of a member of the Quartermain family was not a simple matter. It represented a direct threat to one of Port Charles' most influential dynasties. Dante wasted no time in reaching out to an old trusted ally, Nathan West, who had recently returned to Port Charles after an inexplicable 7-year absence. Despite his complicated history and the gaps in his memory, Nathan had proven himself to be a capable and dedicated police officer, and Dante needed his sharp instincts. When Dante called Nathan into his office at the PCPD, he found his former partner eager to jump back into action. "Nathan, I need your help on something big," Dante said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Ned Quartermain was poisoned. He collapsed outside Bobby's yesterday, and right now, he's in the hospital fighting for his life. The family is demanding answers. Nathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with focus. "Poisoned? Who would want to hurt Ned? He's practically harmless compared to the rest of Port Charles. That's what we need to find out," Dante replied, sliding a folder across the desk. "I'm putting you on this investigation. We'll work together, just like old times." The two detectives immediately began their work, combing through statements and evidence. One crucial detail emerged quickly: the poison had been administered through something Ned had consumed at Bobby's, likely in a drink or food item. But who would have had the opportunity to tamper with his drink? And more importantly, who had a motive? The hotel discovery. Days into their investigation, as they followed lead after lead, something remarkable surfaced. One of the officers reviewing the timeline noticed something peculiar in hotel records. According to the information they had received, Ronnie Bard, Monica Quartermain's long-lost sister, who had recently come to Port Charles, had supposedly left town immediately after the will reading fiasco. However, when Dante began making inquiries, he discovered an astonishing fact: Ronnie was still in Port Charles, registered at a small hotel not far from the city center under an assumed name. She said she left, Nathan said, examining the hotel records with a furrowed brow. Everyone believed she had gone back home. Why would she lie about that? That's exactly the question we need to answer, Dante replied, his detective instincts tingling. Let's bring her in for questioning. But before they could move, Dante decided to pursue another angle. Security footage from various locations around the Quartermain mansion and Bobby's might provide crucial clues. He obtained a warrant and began the painstaking process of reviewing countless hours of surveillance video. It was tedious, monotonous work, but then, in the late evening of the third day of investigation, Dante's screen froze on an image that made his heart skip a beat. There, clear as day, was Ronnie Bard sneaking through the back entrance of the Quartermain mansion in the dead of night, roughly 48 hours before Ned's collapse. Her movements were furtive and deliberate, her face tense with purpose. She wasn't visiting as a family member, making a casual call. She was infiltrating the house like an intruder. The motive revealed. When Dante and Nathan brought Ronnie in for questioning the following morning, the atmosphere in the interrogation room was thick with tension. Ronnie initially maintained her innocence, insisting that the camera footage must have been doctored or that she simply had a right to be in the house as a family member. However, as Dante presented evidence after evidence, the hotel registration under a false name, the security footage, the poison found in Ned's system, Ronnie's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. It was Nathan who finally broke through her defenses with a simple but penetrating question. Ronnie, why did you sneak into the mansion in the middle of the night? Nathan asked, his voice calm but relentless. What were you looking for? What were you trying to do? For a long moment, Ronnie said nothing. Then, with a deep breath, the floodgates opened. Her anger, which had been simmering beneath the surface for years, finally erupted. She spoke of Monica's cruel rejection of her when she was just 16 years old, of the pain of being cast out by her own sister and left to fend for herself in a harsh world. She explained how, when Monica had finally reached out through letters in her final months, Ronnie had dared to hope for reconciliation and recognition. I thought she was going to make things right, Ronnie said, her voice breaking with emotion. I thought she understood what I had suffered because of her. But then I discovered that the inheritance she had promised me, the Quartermain house that was supposed to be my redemption, was conditional on Tracy's approval. Tracy, who had never shown me anything but contempt. She was given the house, the legacy, everything I had been denied. Dante leaned back in his chair, beginning to understand the twisted logic that had driven Ronnie to such desperate measures. So you decided to poison Ned? Nathan asked quietly. I poisoned his drink at Bobby's to send a message, Ronnie admitted, her voice hollow. I wanted the family to suffer the way I had suffered. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to lose someone precious. But I didn't want to kill him, just make him sick enough to understand the pain, the complications. What Ronnie hadn't anticipated was that Ned's heart was weaker than she realized. The poison had triggered a severe cardiac event that nearly killed him. She had intended to deliver a lesson, but she had instead nearly dealt a fatal blow. As Dante read Ronnie her Miranda rights and placed handcuffs around her wrists, he couldn't help but feel a complex mixture of emotions. Justice demanded that Ronnie be held accountable for her actions, yet the tragic circumstances of her past and the desperation that had driven her to this point were impossible to ignore. However, even as they arrested Ronnie, Dante and Nathan knew their investigation was far from over. The case had too many loose ends, too many questions that still demanded answers. Why had Ronnie been so certain that Tracy had betrayed her? Were there other players involved in this drama? And most critically, Would the evidence hold up in court, or would clever defense attorneys find loopholes in their investigation? The uncertain future. As autumn turned to winter in Port Charles, Ned slowly recovered in his hospital bed, his strength gradually returning. The Quartermain family rallied around him, their questions and suspicions pointing in all directions. Meanwhile, Ronnie awaited trial, her future hanging in the balance. She maintained her innocence to some extent, arguing that while she may have acted rashly, her intention had never been to kill her family member. Dante and Nathan continued their work, knowing that building an airtight case against Ronnie would require meticulous attention to detail and unwavering commitment to justice. The truth, they were learning, was far more complex than any one confession could fully explain. In Port Charles, where secrets ran deep and motives were often muddled by family dysfunction and past traumas, the pursuit of justice was rarely straightforward. As the two detectives closed their files at the end of another long day, Nathan turned to Dante and offered a knowing smile. "Welcome back to the PCPD," Dante said. "Looks like you never lost your touch." "Yeah," Nathan replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "But I get the feeling this case is going to get a lot more complicated before it gets simpler." Dante nodded grimly, knowing his partner was absolutely right. In the world of soap opera drama and Port Charles intrigue, the truth was often just the beginning of a much longer, more twisted tale. Next, we will learn about the issue of Carlisle's potentially catastrophic decision to seek revenge on Jack Brennan at the absolute worst possible moment in Port Charles history. The timing couldn't be more dangerous, and the consequences of her impulsive actions could ripple far beyond her personal vendetta, affecting not just her loved ones, but potentially threatening lives on a global scale. The dangerous game Jack Brennan is playing. Jack Brennan has assembled an elite operational team with one singular, critical mission: to dismantle and neutralize the successors of the notorious Caesar Phazon before they can successfully complete their cold fusion project. This isn't just another Port Charles conspiracy or local criminal enterprise. This is a matter of international security with implications that extend far beyond the borders of their small town. The cold fusion technology that Phazon's followers are attempting to perfect represents a weapon of unimaginable power, the kind of scientific breakthrough that in the wrong hands could destabilize entire governments and threaten countless innocent lives across multiple continents. Brennan's operation is complex, multi-layered, and requires absolute precision. He's been working with the WSB and coordinating with international intelligence agencies to track every movement, every transaction, and every communication among Phazon's network. The stakes are astronomical, and one wrong move, one premature exposure of his mission, could alert the villains and cause them to accelerate their timeline or worse disappear underground where they'd be impossible to track. Carlisle's maternal instincts override common sense. While it's entirely understandable that Carlisle's protective mama bear instincts have been triggered regarding her daughter Jocelyn Jax, her emotional reaction is clouding her judgment in ways that could prove disastrous. Yes, Brennan recruited Jocelyn for dangerous intelligence work without fully disclosing the risks involved. Yes, he put Carlisle's daughter directly in harm's way, which is an unforgivable breach of trust in Carlisle's eyes. But what Carly fails to grasp in her rage-fueled quest for vengeance is that her actions against Brennan, right now at this precise moment, could inadvertently create the exact opening that these international criminals need to execute their plans. The villains currently operating in Port Charles are watching, waiting, and looking for any sign of weakness or distraction in Brennan's operation. If Carly succeeds in undermining Brennan's authority, exposing his mission, or forcing him to divide his attention and resources to deal with her interference, she could be handing these dangerous criminals the advantage they've been desperately seeking. Every minute that Brennan has to spend managing Carlisle's vendetta is a minute he's not focused on stopping a potential global catastrophe. The shadowy laboratory and its sinister occupants. The work that Professor Henry Dalton is conducting in that secretive laboratory is deeply troubling and shrouded in layers of deception and danger. Dalton isn't working alone. He's partnered with Jen Sidwell and Pascal, who was previously Britt Westburn's boss and is known throughout international criminal circles for his ruthlessness and complete lack of moral boundaries. These aren't amateur criminals or small-time operators. They're sophisticated, well-funded, and absolutely committed to seeing Faison's final vision come to fruition regardless of the human cost. The cold fusion research they're conducting represents cutting-edge science being twisted for malevolent purposes. If they succeed in stabilizing the reaction and weaponizing the technology, the resulting device could be sold to the highest bidder on the black market, likely ending up in the hands of terrorist organizations, rogue nations, or criminal cartels. The potential for devastation is staggering. Entire cities could be held hostage, governments could be toppled, and the global balance of power could shift dramatically. Britt Westburn faces multiple threats. Britt finds herself in an impossibly dangerous position, trapped between multiple threats with no clear path to safety. On one front, if the research project she's been coerced into supporting fails to produce results, she could lose access to the experimental medicine that's keeping her alive. A death sentence disguised as a business transaction. Her medical condition makes her vulnerable to manipulation and forces her to cooperate with people she would otherwise never associate with. But the threats don't end there. If Brennan discovers that Jason Morgan double-crossed him regarding Britt's involvement, she could find herself shipped off to Steinmoor, the notorious maximum security prison where conditions are brutal and survival is never guaranteed. Brennan has already threatened Jason, making it crystal clear that betrayal will not be tolerated and that consequences will be severe. Britt is essentially caught in a vice, with pressure coming from all sides and no good options available to her. It's crucial to note that Britt almost certainly didn't enter this dangerous situation voluntarily. The evidence strongly suggests she was forced into this collaboration against her will, coerced through threats to her health, her freedom, or both. While Carly may harbor personal animosity toward Britt and might not particularly care about her well-being, Jason definitely does care. And his emotional investment in protecting Britt adds another layer of complexity to this already tangled situation. Moreover, there's a debt that apparently everyone except Carly seems to remember. Britt once saved Jocelyn's life when the Hook was terrorizing Port Charles. That heroic act, which should have earned Britt permanent gratitude from the Corinthos Spencer family, seems to have been conveniently forgotten by Carly in her current state of anger and desire for revenge. This selective memory is characteristic of Carly. When she's operating in full protective mode, she becomes singularly focused on the perceived threat to her children and loses sight of the bigger picture and past debts of gratitude. The complex web of endangered lives. The number of characters whose lives hang in the balance because of this situation is staggering. Jason is trying to protect both Britt and maintain his cover while working with Brennan. Jocelyn is in danger because of her recruitment into intelligence work. Britt faces multiple life-threatening scenarios. Innocent researchers and support staff in the laboratory could become collateral damage if the situation explodes. And that's not even counting the countless unnamed civilians in Port Charles and beyond who would suffer if the cold fusion weapon is completed and deployed. Jack Brennan is actively trying to prevent a global disaster of massive proportions. This isn't hyperbole or exaggeration. The threat is real, imminent, and potentially catastrophic. Yet Carly is doing exactly what she always does when her children are involved. She leaps into action first and bothers to look at the consequences afterward. This impulsive pattern has gotten her into trouble countless times before, but the stakes have never been this high. Valentin Casadin's manipulation. Carly's revenge plot becomes even more problematic when you factor in Valentin Casadin's involvement and his own agenda. By targeting Brennan now, Carly could be throwing Jack to the wolves, and Valentin is very much one of those wolves, circling and waiting for his opportunity to strike. Valentin is encouraging Carly to make hasty, ill-advised moves not out of concern for her or Jocelyn, but because of his own obsessive fixation on revenge against Brennan. While Carly may no longer care what happens to Jack After his betrayal regarding Jocelyn, she absolutely does care about innocent people getting hurt, particularly her own children. The tragic irony is that her actions, intended to protect Jocelyn, may actually place her daughter in even greater danger by destabilizing Brennan's operation and giving the villains room to maneuver. Carly's pattern of impulsive decisions. Brennan is working tirelessly to keep Dalton, Sidwell, Pascal, and the others from bringing about impending doom. Meanwhile, Valentin is manipulating Carly into making a hasty, potentially disastrous move because his desire for revenge has completely clouded his judgment and he's willing to sacrifice anyone to achieve his goals. Yes, Brennan lied to Carly about what he was recruiting Jocelyn for. Yes, he put her daughter in a hazardous situation that has led her down an increasingly dangerous path. These are legitimate grievances, and Carly's anger is justified. However, Carly may be in way over her head this time. Unlike her ex-husband Sonny Corinthos and her best friend Jason Morgan, who are both strategic thinkers capable of playing the long game, Carly tends to act solely on impulse and emotion. If Jason were available to counsel her right now, he would undoubtedly tell her to take a deep breath, count to 10, and think through all the potential consequences before taking action. The reality is that everyone loves Carly. She's loyal, fierce, and would do anything for her family. But right now, she desperately needs to stop and think for a minute before she does something irreversible. She's operating on extreme anger and zero self-control, following Valentin blindly without questioning his motives or considering that he's using her as a weapon in his personal war against Brennan. Jack has a completely legitimate concern about what could happen if Faison's final project goes off without a hitch. This isn't about personal ambition or WSB politics. It's about preventing a weapon of mass destruction from being completed and deployed. The deadly threat Valentin poses. Valentin Casadini won't hesitate for a nanosecond to eliminate Jack Brennan the first chance he gets. He's a loose cannon, driven by vengeance and operating without the constraints of loyalty to any organization or code of conduct. The WSB is not some local security firm or private investigator. It's an international intelligence organization with vast resources and a long memory. Carly is quite literally playing with fire, and she doesn't seem to fully grasp just how badly she could get burned. Despite all his mistakes and deceptions, there's strong evidence that Brennan would never actually kill Carly. No matter what errors in judgment he's made, Brennan is madly, deeply in love with Carly in a way that's transformed him. When she nearly died from polonium poisoning, which happened because she unknowingly drank poisoned champagne that was actually meant for Jack, courtesy of Valentin. By the way, Jack was absolutely horrified. The image of Brennan sitting by Carly's hospital bedside, telling her that she had his heart, revealed a vulnerability and depth of emotion that few people have ever witnessed from this hardened intelligence operative. The intensity of his feelings suggests that he's never felt this way about anyone else in his entire life. Brennan may be ruthless in his professional capacity, willing to make hard choices and morally gray decisions to accomplish his missions. But the idea that he would ever physically harm Carly is virtually impossible to believe. Valentin has convinced Carly that Brennan is a threat to her safety, but this is a manipulation tactic designed to turn her into an unwitting accomplice in Valentin's murder plot. Valentin will absolutely kill Jack the first chance he gets, and if Carly's actions create that opening, she'll have blood on her hands whether she intended it or not. The global implications of Carly's actions. Carly is taking a massive, potentially civilization-altering risk by targeting Brennan at this critical juncture. Considering Caesar Faison's history, his decades of international terrorism, his brilliant but twisted mind, and his numerous attempts to acquire weapons of mass destruction, her actions could possibly lead to consequences that extend far beyond Port Charles. If Faison's final project succeeds because Carly's interference prevented Brennan from stopping it, the resulting destruction could span continents. The cold fusion weapon represents the culmination of Faison's life's work, his final legacy of chaos and destruction. If it falls into the wrong hands or is successfully deployed, The devastation would make every previous threat Port Charles has faced look trivial by comparison. Carly needs to set aside her personal feelings, her justified anger at Brennan's deception, and recognize that there's a time for revenge and a time for cooperation in service of the greater good. Right now, in this moment, the world needs Jack Brennan focused entirely on his mission, not fighting a war on two fronts against both international criminals and Carly's vendetta.